Good afternoon again, and welcome to the Summit on Conflict, Cooperation, and Diplomacy. My name is Max Kovalov, and I'm the director of the Mroz Global Leadership Institute at the College of Charleston. The mission of the Mroz Global Leadership Institute is to promote essential skills of global fluency and help our students and educate new generations of students about diplomacy. We work to prepare students to become future global leaders through a variety of professional development programs, speaker series, and different types of programs. Our speaker series and this summit are an important part of the Mroz Institute programming designed to bring to campus prominent leaders with international experience so that they would stimulate discussions with our faculty, students, and members of the Charleston community. Thank you for joining us tonight in person or remotely. I now will turn the program to one of the global ambassadors. The Global Ambassadors Program is one of the programs of the Mroz Institute, and one of the global ambassadors is Caroline Burke, and she will introduce the first speaker today.
Thank you, Dr. Kovalov. It is my pleasure to introduce tonight's first guest. David Hickton founded the Institute for Cyber Law, Policy, and Security in 2017 at the University of Pittsburgh and serves as its founding director. He holds faculty appointments in the School of Law, the School of Computing and Information, the Graduate School of Public and International Affairs. In 2020 to 2021, Mr. Hickton served as a staff director and senior counsel for the House Select Subcommittee on the Coronavirus Crisis. From 2010 to 2016, he served as the U.S. Attorney for the Western District of Pennsylvania, where he prosecuted groundbreaking cyber cases, including a first-of-its-kind indictment against members of the Chinese military for economic espionage. Mr. Hickton had a distinguished career in private legal practice. He has been named Pennsylvania Attorney of the Year, Distinguished Alumni of the Pitt School of Law, and a University of Pittsburgh Legacy Laureate. He has been admitted before numerous courts, including the U.S. Supreme Court, and has graduated from the Pennsylvania State University and the University of Pittsburgh School of Law. Mr. Hickton, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
When a supposed cyber expert takes the podium and can't work the technology, it usually leads to an evacuation of the room. Thank you, Carolyn, for that generous introduction, and thanks to all of you for coming, and special thanks to the leadership of the College of Charleston, the Institute, for this generous introduction to be here. I'm honored to be here, especially with the panel. I want to tell you that I'm the least qualified of this distinguished panel, and I want to pay special mention to one of my heroes, Joe Nye, who has informed my work throughout my career. I first started following Professor Nye when he was in the Carter administration, the Clinton administration, and if you wanted to understand what I was trying to do, it was mimic his leadership in being an original thinker and to try and apply the rule of law to digital space. So when I had the opportunity to be U.S. Attorney in Western Pennsylvania, the first principle of that experience was to take inventory of what the threats were in my district and then try to intelligently apply my resources to deal with those threats. And I felt that one of the things that was apparent to me is that we had a drip, drip, drip of American technology for almost a decade before I came into office, and that this problem was going to rob us of our ability to be competitive. When I began to start my work to build a cyber group dedicated to dealing with this problem, my friend Sean Sweeney, who's seated over here, who worked at the Department of Justice, had worked at my law firm, became my cyber mentor. He parked his consulting business across the street so I could actually understand what the FBI was explaining to me as we started doing our investigation. Sean now works for Oracle, is a bigwig there, in residence here in Charleston, and in between worked over at Microsoft. But no one really understood what this problem was. So I just want to tell you one crisp story before I tell you what the Russian and Chinese signature looks like, and why this matters, what we've done about it, and hopefully create a good foundation for Professor Nye's talk about what we can do going forward. I met with the president of U.S. Steel and the president of the United Steelworkers in America. Those are two institutions in Pittsburgh where I live. I had just a small office of 100 people out of 100,000 at the DOJ with only 40 lawyers effectively. And I met with them with the hope that they would present mentors to my efforts to find a solution to kids in the poor communities, the minority communities in Pittsburgh who were making bad decisions about drugs and guns. They were immediately helpful, but as a condition of their offer to me, they wanted me to understand how serious the problem of hacking, particularly from China, was. I did a little research and I began to understand that China was 7 or 8 times our size, had entered the World Trade Organization to the applause of, including these two people I was meeting with, most of the American business and labor leadership, because it was a quarter of the world in a new market. But they had no architecture for research and development. They had no architecture for innovation. And in a short period of time, it was pretty clear that they were reverse engineering products competing with our American companies in our American markets, and that they were robbing us of our investment in American innovation. And so we set about to investigate a case which became epic and famous. It was the first case that was ever done, where the tool of indictment was used to address nation-state hacking, and it was a case against the Chinese military. It was brought in May of 2014. You probably heard about it at the time because it created a lot of fanfare. We indicted 5 members of Unit 61398 of the Chinese Army in Pittsburgh. I repeat that. We indicted the Chinese Army in Pittsburgh. We indicted them on behalf of Alcoa, U.S. Steel, Westinghouse, Allegheny Technologies, which was another steel company, and the United Steelworkers of America for various acts of theft through the cyber medium. We indicted them under an old statute, the 1986 Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. And we indicted them with pictures of the perpetrators at the back of the 50-page indictment and a schedule of how they did their work in Shanghai at an identified building on a specific street. We did this because before we did this indictment, there were major efforts to try and bring China to the table through the State Department and otherwise, through démarches, to explain you can't come into our companies through a cyber hacking effort and steal from us. And China said, we're not doing it. And we said, yes, you are. And they said, show us the evidence. And we did. Now, this case is still debated to this day about whether it was effective, because those 5 individuals have never been brought to justice in the federal court in Pittsburgh. But I submit to you, and we'll talk about it a little bit more later, something more important happened, because less than a year after that case happened, President Xi came to the United States and in the Rose Garden met with President Obama and announced that we are still going to spy on each other, which was a line we agreed with, but we're no longer going to steal your intellectual property, which you value as a national asset and which you invest in through your private enterprise system. And that agreement was memorialized by trips by the Attorney General and the Secretary of Homeland Security on a biannual basis and largely held for a period of years until the next administration announced a sanction campaign. It by no means solved the problem with China, but it certainly started the campaign to reverse the campaign of this steady drain of our national assets, which is our investment in discovery. Now, that case operates as a large oak tree over everything else we did. We ultimately did about 50 cases. We had the ball in Pittsburgh for China and Russia. New York had Iran, and LA had North Korea at that time. Those are our four principal adversaries. The other three cases on this chart are equally important, and they demonstrate what was the Chinese signature 10 years ago. The Boyasek case was the forward-facing front for the Ministry of State Security or the Chinese spy network. This case was brought to sort of trust and verify what we had achieved in the case against the Chinese army. In the lexicon of the day, we called these groups APT-1, or Advanced Persistent Threat Group 1, the Army, and Advanced Persistent Threat Group 3, Boyasek, which was actually the spy entity. We brought this case after the agreement between Xi and Obama to demonstrate that we were resolved to investigate and charge others if they violated the agreement. And we effectively took Boyasek off the playing field. But if you want to understand what this was about, as distinct from the case against the Army, this was about global positioning satellite technology. And the victims were Siemens and Trimble Corporation. You don't have to think long and hard to realize how important that is. Bombs, planes, air traffic control systems, your MapQuest. But interestingly, what China was really interested in, we think, was the access to that technology for precision agriculture, because they don't have enough crop acreage to feed their people. And one of the threats that we can talk about when we talk about the future is China is buying up large portions of the world for that and exploration of important precious minerals, and we're not paying attention to it. So just as we did with the Army, with the Chinese spy network, we felt it was important, even if we didn't bring the defendants to the courtroom, to declare that this was not going to be acceptable. In May of 2015, the Thomas Rukavina case and the SAT case were done almost back to back. The Thomas Rukavina case represents an example of a Chinese threat, and it ended up with a very sad result because he killed himself after the first day in court. Thomas Rukavina was an engineer with PPG, which stands for Pittsburgh Plate Glass, which is a paint, chemical, and glass company, and one of our iconic corporations in Pittsburgh. For some reason, which I still do not understand, his employment relationship ended poorly, and he became susceptible at an initiative from a Chinese spy to selling the precious details for how we made windshields for our commercial and our military jets, which contain all sorts of important proprietary technology in them. And if that were lost, we would be at great danger. He was operating with someone in California, and he was taking the information from his former employer and selling it for money. We caught him. We were on the verge of breaking the larger scheme. When we went to court, we told the court that we wanted to detain him before the trial to preserve the evidence and to capture the conspiracy. We were joined in that motion by his family, who was afraid that he was going to take his own life out of shame. The judge overruled both us and the family, and he went home and hung himself that night. We immediately went out to Compton, California to try and capture the co-conspirators, and the warehouse was closed. Nevertheless, this case was important, as sad as it was, because this problem is part of the Chinese signature. The SAT case is of equal importance. In May of 2015, we indicted 15 individuals who were called gunmen. They were here positioned by the Chinese government to take the SAT test and the GRE and the MedCats as part of a large group of people as imposters for individuals from China who couldn't even speak English. These people here in America would take the test. The test would be accredited or credited to people who were going to come over here and go to our American universities. They would receive a passport, a student visa would be issued, and frankly, our American universities were somewhat complicit because they would get 4 years of premium tuition in advance from the government of China. Effectively, this was taking spots away from American students, particularly in our state universities, where engineering degrees were being purchased by a fraud. I was told by DHS when we did this case that we could have done 15 indictments per hour. We could have indicted 50. That's how widespread this network was. The humorous family aside was 2 of our 6 children were in the middle of taking their SATs. And those of you who have taken them recently know that after the first one, you get some analytics about the second one. This case shut down the SAT test. And I have 2 sons who are still upset about it. They did fine, but this was a really big deal, and it led to an effort that has continued and sometimes gets overheated through xenophobia to really try to monitor whether we are, in addition to sacrificing our innovation over the internet, we are sacrificing our educational opportunities. Because whatever you say, even though we're 1/8 of their size, America is still the cradle of education, and it's still the cradle of innovation. So this represented the Chinese signature when I was in the government. I'm going to tell you a little bit how it has evolved. These are some of the more recent attacks, and if you just paid attention to the news today, the Ministry of State Security, the spy network, has been exposed by a disclosure of documents through Mandiant, one of the better consultants in this area, of their widespread and continuous hacking efforts across the globe, and especially here. The Chinese effort to hack us was economic, and it was largely for innovation and education. It has now evolved to an infrastructure risk. We are now very concerned about attacks on our electric grid, and as I'll talk at the end, attacks on our water supply. China has also been in our Office of Management and Budget, our Office of Personnel, and other places. But I submit to you that you need to be very careful of painting with too broad a brush, because I'm one who believes that the intelligence community is a very important component of world stability. And we have always spied on each other, and we've always spied on our own allies because it creates a measure of certainty. So when we hit the digital age, it isn't like we're going to eliminate the intelligence world, but what we were trying to do very carefully, and I remember this very vividly in the green room as we announced the case against the Army, we were not to talk about eliminating spying or eavesdropping. We were only to talk about the lane that had been created by an Obama executive order about protecting our innovation. And the same was true with the other cases. So when you're paying attention now to the Chinese signature, you should see it as a volume shopper, largely economic, but trending into the area of infrastructure attacks. These are some quotes which reflect that. CISA, if you don't know, is the component within the Department of Homeland Security, which works very hard and does a very good job, in my opinion, on identifying infrastructure risk to us. So I want to turn now quickly to the Russian threat. The Russian threat signature is distinct from the Chinese threat. The Russian threat signature is largely less of a volume attack and more of a strategic attack. It's not a unit of the army. it is largely a cohort of criminals who are allowed to roam free by the leadership in Russia, and then they are harnessed when it is important for those cyber crime arteries to be utilized for state action. We did the Bogachev case 2 weeks after we did the case against China in 2014. Evgeny Bogachev is maybe the most famous cyber criminal in the world, as far as I'm concerned. The case is evergreen because Putin was using Bogachev to jam Ukraine in the original Crimean invasion in 2013 and 2014, and he's still using those cyber arteries today. Bogachev was the leader of something called the Business Club, which was the third generation application of what was known as the Zeus malware. Zeus 1 was attacked by the US government in 2005, Zeus 2 in 2009, and Zeus 3.0, which was a decentralized peer-to-peer Zeus network, which made it particularly pernicious because whereas before we could cut off the server as if we were cutting off the head of the organism and it would be dead, what happened with Zeus 3.0 was it was peer-to-peer, and it was like pruning one of your bushes. If we cut off one limb, it would spawn some others. But we were very successful in a multinational effort takedown in Pittsburgh and at the European Cybercrime Commission at The Hague with other sorry about that. When you have 6 children, they call you at all hours. The takedown involved not only a criminal prosecution of Bogachev, but it involved a seizure of the domain. We were able, working with private partners, to break the Game Over Zeus crime syndicate and take over the Business Club. And Bogachev is off the playing field. We have a multi-million-dollar reward out for him, which I bought 2 ties at least on 2 occasions, thinking I was going to announce his capture. I still believe he will be captured. He was the subject of a 60 Minutes program just 2 years ago. That's why he was so important. And generally, he is the godfather of all Russian hacking. You can almost trace, like iodine, all Russian hacking groups back to the group that was part of the Bogachev network. Evil corporation, which you may have read about in the news today as well, because Russia, for the first time, has charged criminally one of these entities, which I think is in response to the charge that I just made again, that they let these criminals run free. The Bugat Drydeck Krydex group was another malware group that came right out of the Business Club and Bogachev. And then you all probably read and heard a lot about the 2016 hack of the election. That investigation was led by my office under my supervision. There's no question that Russia was in our machinery in 2016. We were never involved in the question of collusion by the Trump campaign. We were involved solely in Pittsburgh with regard to the question of whether Russia was hacking us. And why anybody debates that is beyond me. You can look forward to the bipartisan Senate report that was offered by Richard Burr and Mark Warner, which conclusively establishes, you can read that, or you look backward to before 2016 and realize that we were hacked in 2000, we were hacked in 2004, we were hacked in 2008, both Obama and McCain. Romney was hacked by the Russians in 2012. Why wouldn't be hacked in 2016? And forget that for a moment. You can just look at Russia's signature. They hacked the country of Georgia. They hacked the country of Estonia. They hacked Italy. They hacked France. They hacked Germany. It's part of their statecraft because their strategy is to reconstitute the Soviet Union. The way they do that is destroying democracy and breaking up NATO, which has provided us the foundation for the longest period of peace that we've ever known. So all of this work represents the Russian signature, which is largely strategic for state action, less economic. Russia doesn't really have anything anybody wants. Their economy is roughly the size of Italy. They are not what we need to be concerned about long-term, but they are a tremendous threat as a short-term disruptor, in my opinion. So the problem with dealing with Russia going forward is they are now really ramping up their infiltration and attacks on our infrastructure. And our elections have now been declared part of our critical infrastructure, but a second Obama executive order came out in 2013, which announced that we were going to protect our critical infrastructure. So Obama had really 3 executive orders you need to be aware of. 2011 was protect our intellectual property. 2013 is protect our critical infrastructure. And 2015, and based directly on the case in Pittsburgh and stated so in the executive order, was the Sony executive order, which basically said if we can't bring the defendants to the courtroom, if we have enough evidence, we're going to use that evidence to apply other tools. And that was really a guiding principle of my work. The author of Soft Power, the author of Smart Power, inspired me to believe that the application of the law and the extension of options for our policymakers puts us in a position that we don't have to have the choice that John Bolton was advocating at one point, that either you don't hack us, or if you do, we're going to launch nukes. We need some tools in between there. And so I personally believe that this question answers itself. Why does it matter? Are you worried about election security? I mean, the Russian threat in 2016 had 2 broad components to it. They were in all 50 states. They had actually only moved in Illinois, but they were in the position to move in 7 other states. But there is no question that they had access to our election machinery in all 50 states. In fact, the state of Maryland, to save money, offloaded or subcontracted some of their election services and accidentally did that with a Russian oligarch company called ByteGrid. That's why this matters. Critical infrastructure. It's likely that the next war we face could be a war without bullets or bombs, that we could be checkmated by an entity which tells us, we have just frozen your banking system, we've just frozen your air traffic control system, we are going to shut off your electric grid. That's what we're worried about right now. Now, our economic innovation and our IP remains important. The only way we compete today for our children and our grandchildren is if we can continue to be, based upon places like the College of Charleston, the cradle of education and the cradle of innovation. Our system rewards through patent, trademark, and licensing. If you come up with an idea, we're going to give you some room to roam to recapture the benefit of that idea, which gives an incentive to the next person who has a great idea. You have an innovation lab here I saw on my tour today. It's fundamental to our system. If we are not going to do that, and we're going to let people just take over the internet, it's no different than a truck pulling up to a warehouse and cracking the lock in the middle of the night and taking the stuff out of a warehouse. It's just over a digital platform. And more importantly, if you did it, you would be in prison. So why would we surrender to overseas actors? But when we talk about this and what we do, the question becomes, is it working? You might imagine that when I was doing my work, we were talking about the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and there were people in the Obama administration saying, who's this lunatic in Pittsburgh who's just indicted China? Because we were trying to engage China at the same time. I'm an advocate that even with your adversaries, you have to engage them and apply all the tools, whether it's State Department, Commerce, Treasury, Department of Justice. You have to use sanctions and incentives, punishments and opportunities. And so I'm a big believer that you can't dismiss your adversary, and you can't just poke your adversary with sort of, to use the old Saturday Night Live Will Ferrell, George Bush, no strategery. You have to have some strategery about what you're doing. So I believe that the Obama-Xi agreement was a tremendous achievement. Most people recognize that intellectual property theft between China and the United States was on the decline. And when we took Boyasek off the playing field and we told him we see a violation here, like a referee throwing a penalty flag, there was a double down of that reduction, and there was progress being made. But if you're responding to that progress with the next administration by saying we're just going to put sanctions on all Chinese products without some strategy attendant to it, you can understand why President Xi basically said deal's over. And now the problem is a lot worse than it was. I personally am a fan of Joe Biden's policy of China. I know a lot of the people who are in the various departments who are applying this, but if you look at what the Commerce Department has been doing, I think you have to recognize that that is the amplification and an increase of the use of the full toolbox. It all starts with an investigation, because any cyber case is simply this: can you establish attribution or pin the cyber tail on the cyber donkey to defeat anonymization, which is how they try to hide? We're talking about disappearing evidence by actors who are operating in the dark, where the technology moves too fast and the law moves too slow. So this is a very challenging environment. But the first step is to say you did it, and here's the evidence that you did it. Now, if we can't get you to agree to extradite your defendants to us, here's what we're going to do. You can't participate in our markets unless you stop doing it. And I think, at least I hope Joe doesn't think otherwise, that that's some form of smart power and some form of soft power. These are the tools that I think we've now worked towards as we have engaged and as we've progressed, but it's very hard for me to say that the problem is getting better. Yeah, I used to make the joke that if you want to see a problem in the US government get bad, put me in charge of it, because I took on cyber and I took on opioids. But I figure if you're going to get an opportunity to work in the government, you might as well take on the big problems and dedicate the resources to starting the effort. We had the same struggle, if you think about it, with drug cartels from Colombia years ago. And there were a lot of naysayers who said, we cannot prosecute those people because we can't extradite those people. We'll just make them mad and it'll get worse. And we pursued it and we fought and we made it a campaign to respond to a campaign. And that's what I've been about and why I believe that this is important. But we have a lot of work to do going forward. China's membership in the World Trade Organization gave us an institutional basis to grieve trade disputes, to grieve this type of stuff. The trouble is we ended up with a lawfare effort by China and, frankly, a lot of American law firms and a lot of American contractors who decided that they were going to be hired by China and gum up the system. The theft of the United Steelworkers of America, in the case I told you about, was the expert notes for a World Trade Organization case. That's what they stole from the United Steelworkers. So I met Joe Nye, my hero, at Harvard and MIT in 2017 when I had just started Pitt Cyber. And I was honored to be invited there to be introduced to what was at that point called Cyber Norms 5.0, which meant there were 4.0 before it. But I'm now a big believer, and a large part of my work on a daily basis is about trying to extend beyond my former job as a prosecutor and see if we can develop an intelligent framework of agreements. And in that respect, I want to make this statement that I've made many times before, because people sometimes misunderstand my point of view about it. I believe China is the linchpin of that effort. They are the #2 economy in the world, and they're probably going to be #1 someday. They, like a bank and like the United States, have something that people want to steal. So they have a community of interest with us. They've been hacked this year. If you paid attention, one of their banks was hacked. So now they're a hacking victim too. And I think that if we can somehow come together, it's going to be hard, it's going to be difficult, and there are people who tell me I'm crazy when I say it. But I think the can-do attitude necessary to make an understanding in the cyber norm and diplomacy realm with China will be a council of the willing, and will bring on the rest of the world. And without it, we're left with nothing but the Wild West. So, a couple last closing thoughts, and then I'll open up for questions. Everything I just told you is worse if we put on the blender of artificial intelligence, and then we go to quantum computing. The horizon for quantum computing keeps getting pushed back, but everybody predicts that once we get to quantum computing on scale, there'll be no password that'll be safe. And so the question then will become, is there anything safe? I operate from the first premise of pre-digital norms. Maybe it's being a parent of 6. But if a teacher sends me a review of one of my children, just because it comes in a backpack and a piece of paper or over the internet, it's equally private to me. It's none of your business. If I accidentally take Sean's work, I can't take it, I can't sell it, I can't publish it under pre-digital norms. That was our expectation. Even litigation as a lawyer, for those of you who want to be lawyers, we have this concept called privilege. And if you accidentally get a privileged document, there's the doctrine of inadvertent disclosure, and you have to return it. So my mind goes crazy and my head pops off my shoulders when I see things like WikiLeaks publishing private emails from people, because I think the foundation of a lot of our law is your expectation of privacy. There's a huge age gap between us when that happens. And many people who grew up entirely on the internet believe that everything is private unless you opt into privacy, whereas I believe it's private unless you opt out. And that might be the age divide. But when you talk about quantum computing and maybe even generative AI, the question is anything safe on the digital platform? I hope it is. I think we have to make a decision whether we can cooperate or compete, or maybe some hybrid version of both with China. I think that's probably most likely, but I don't want to rob any of the thunder of other speakers on that subject. I think I really wanted to tee up that question because that's what I think is the essential question going forward. I'm going to close with this humorous picture. That's me playing basketball. That's my last basketball game in high school. We lost that game because it was my last game. We were upset in the local playoffs in Pennsylvania before a rematch with our rival Ringgold. I played for Keystone Oaks. Ringgold's best player was a guy by the name of Joe Montana. Maybe you've heard of him. We beat him the year before by 1 point. So everybody was looking forward to this rematch, but unfortunately we had to play this team called Aliquippa. If you look carefully at the jersey of the guy I'm driving past, it says Aliquippa on his shirt. I put this picture up because it's had a resurgence all these decades later, because the big case everybody's talking about right now is Aliquippa. The Aliquippa Water Authority was hacked. How long do you have to think before you realize how bad things could be if we can hack the water supply? CISA, who I told you about earlier, believes this was an Iranian hack because the control system was an Israeli control system. I don't think so. I think it was China because it was the Volt Typhoon malware that was applied. Doesn't really matter. But it does mean that the lesson that I learned in this basketball game of paying attention, not looking ahead, and recognizing that the opponent right in front of you is as important as the one you might get to play next is important. The Aliquippa water supply case is important to the world. Everybody's talking about this, and you can read about it and pay attention to it. One of the things about the case against the Chinese army going back to 2014 is there were only 6 victims in that case. You can presume I could have put more victims in that case. And one of the things I got an education on free, paid for by the American taxpayer, is all the intricacies of American business. And one of the things that I've obsessed over is the vulnerability of our industrial control system. If you think about what happened with Stuxnet, for those of you who are familiar, if we can overheat their controls, they can overheat our controls. If you can change the dial in a hospital on the patient medications, just a notch, you could wipe out a wing of a hospital. If you can shut off our electricity, or you can interfere with some of our critical infrastructure, the experts say that we have about 3 days before people start turning on each other. So I didn't come here to scare you. I'm very appreciative of the opportunity and this great forum that you've put together, and humbled that I've been asked to be part of this all-star cast of speakers. But this matters. It's really, really, really important. And I don't think we can spend enough time talking about it. And with that, Max, I'll take questions.
Thank you very much, David. This is the first of our fantastic lineup of speakers. If you have a question for David on the talk, please raise your hand, and we have a couple of microphones here. If you are watching us on the webinar, please use the Q&A feature, and we will read your question. Any questions?
So you mentioned how the individual's right to privacy is something that is intrinsically valuable to the United States and to like our idea of democracy. But as we know, that right to privacy is not something that the Chinese government prioritizes, especially for individuals. So my question is kind of what are the implications of that like separate or lack of emphasis on that right to privacy in the potential cooperation for cyber intelligence and information protection?
It's definitely a big hurdle. And you can look at how we are aspiring to use artificial intelligence as another example. If you look at our website at Pitt Cyber, we did a fairly important study on artificial intelligence and decision-making algorithms. And in America, we try to use them for the common good. So for example, in Pittsburgh, we use them to decide where the snowplows are going to go most efficiently when it snows, or how are we going to evacuate the stadium when the Steelers play. But a bad way to use it would be to decide because of zip codes, someone is more likely to recommit a crime or be a recidivist. And that just puts technology on top of institutional racism. One of the most controversial parts of that study was facial recognition technology. And China is one of the largest purveyors of facial recognition technology. And it's abundantly clear that they're not only interested in for control of their population, they're interested in getting all of our faces on there so they can improve the quality of it for databases. And so I've had very difficult conversations with some of my old colleagues in the Department of Justice and some state DAs who think that the answer to every crime is to put more cameras up in the city, even if they're made by Chinese entities. And we've had the same problem with Huawei phones, and we have a rich debate on TikTok right now. So this is going to be a hurdle for us because, just like I said with regard to intellectual property, we have a contrast in how we see privacy and what the value of it is.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
For your talk today. My specific question is, what recommendations do you have for educational institutions to better prepare our students now for the threats for the future?
Well, I never miss an opportunity to tout the virtue of cyber literacy. I think the more people know how to use it. Well, interesting story, when I became U.S. Attorney in 2010, I created a cyber literacy test. because I had a bunch of grizzled veterans who had gray file cabinets with locks and yellow pads and wouldn't even use a cell phone. And I said, look, we're going big on cyber. How am I going to get to China with these people? But I decided to make them understand that it was important to understand this digital literacy if you were interested in drug trafficking organizations in the community, if you were interested in healthcare fraud, you had to know this. And that cyber test, Sean remembers this because he helped me put this together, was 14 questions. One was send an email. Another was put something in a file. And not everybody passed the test. So there's a lot of room for improvement on cyber literacy. A second point I would make comes out of an experience I had with a very famous author, David Sanger, who wrote a book I commend to you, The Perfect Weapon, which is a discussion about the cyber threat. And David makes the point, and I think you would expect this from a journalist, but I think it's important to separate that possible bias and hear it. He makes the point that we were able to make the American public support nuclear non-proliferation because they understood the risk. But we've made everything in cyber secret, and people don't understand what the risk is. That was one of the reasons I did the case with China the way I did it. It reads like a novel. Pull it up and read it. It's 50 pages. And the second Mueller indictment, which came out of Pittsburgh, the first one was the troll farms. The second one was the election interference, was 29 pages. It reads like a Netflix episode. I think it's part of the burden of public figures to communicate to the people they serve. This is what your risk is. This is what the threat is. And I think one of the reasons I'm in academia today, although I am serving in a position with the Biden administration that allows me to stay in academia, and that's on declassification, I think that being in academia, I could actually do more right now. And so I would urge you to feel, as a third point, feel a sense of efficacy, that you can make a difference. That would be my guess. Max, right there.
I wondered if you make some remarks about corporations that have actually paid to retrieve their data.
Ransomware.
And
Yeah.
also, I'm wondering if you are able to say whether or not the United States has ever paid such a sum.
I should have mentioned that in the Bogachev case that I told you about, there was also a ransomware component, and that was the first ransomware case. And it's important to understand that because in 10 months, that group had raked in $35 million in ransom payments. At that time, $750 Bitcoin per incident. And if you pay attention now, if you just look at the Colonial Pipeline hack, that was in the millions. To jump to the end of your question, I think we've made progress because we've been able to trace the ransom payments the same way we put the blue dye on the dollar bills when a bank robber gets in there. But the dirty little secret is we do not have a good solution to ransomware. And it is tragic and sad to me that almost on a monthly basis, I get a phone call from a friend or someone who gets my name and says, our company has just been hit with ransomware. All of our receivables are frozen. All of our billing is frozen. And we're going to be out of business in a week. And the choice that we have is pay millions of dollars in Bitcoin to an extortionist with no assurance that we're going to get it back, or pay millions of dollars to a consultant who will try and recover our system, recover our data, and let us start over. Isn't there a better way? And I usually say, no, there's not. You got to protect yourself from ransomware at the front end by backing up your data, segregating your data, and training your employees on cybersecurity hygiene on one essential point. If Sean Sweeney or Joe Nye sends me an email, I do not click on the attachment unless I call. I got one yesterday from my wife. which was an email with an attachment to it that she didn't send. And, you know, when I was doing China and Russia, there were people at the DOJ hardening my system, but I'm not immune from cyber hacking attempts, and nor should any of you believe that you are. But I don't think we have that problem solved yet by any means. That's a big problem.
Chloe, let's take a question from the webinar.
Okay. Our first question is, what do you think would be a good thing to do to begin bridging U.S. relations with China? And do you think that war is inevitable before that?
A good thing to do. I think we need, you can't put the leaders, I'm not a diplomat, but I've seen enough. I don't think you can put the leaders together a lot until they have something they can agree upon. And I have a lot of faith in the people that I see out front in the State Department and Diplomatic Corps in this administration, and I know that they are regularly engaging. So I believe you need to regularly engage and find things that you can agree upon and build organically from those agreements to bigger problems. And then I think you can isolate the problems that you can agree upon and see if you can find some way to chop around the edges of them. That would be my suggestion.
Thank you.
We have one there and one there.
Hello.
How are you?
In the wake of increasing cyber attacks and ransomware attacks, what shifts do you foresee in global cybersecurity policies and strategies to protect critical infrastructure?
There's a lot into that question, but it goes back to the statement I made earlier. Agreements we can make among the Council of the Willing. So we've been some really good work that's come out of Europe. I've been teaching in Europe the last semester because I believe that Europe isn't allergic to regulation like we are. And they have been ahead of us on privacy, and they've been ahead of us on AI. And if you look carefully, the EU has reached some agreements on things that they can agree upon. Economically, you can use your soft power, to use Joe's term, to isolate entities that don't comply with your agreements. And maybe that's smart power at that point. I personally believe that identifying the things that we have in common, like nowhere in the world is it legal to steal. Literally nowhere is it legal to steal. So the question is, what is stealing over digital space? I mean, I actually get in these crazy conversations where people tell me it's not stealing to steal the plans that an engineer from US Steel sends to another engineer from US Steel digitally. I don't understand how that's not stealing. But I think we can probably identify some general principles that we agree upon and build off those principles to more fulsome agreements. But there's a lot going on here. And, you know, I don't want to suggest that I'm declaring the book of Genesis on this. We're in the New Testament on some of these discussions.
David, thank you so much for this discussion. We have a couple of minutes before the next talk, and I want to invite everyone to have a refreshment, and we'll set the stage for the second talk. But please join me for a round of applause.
Thank you. Thank you very much.